The cold came first. Not the cold of a November night in general, but the specific intimate cold of wet metal pressed against the inside of a wrist. The kind of cold that doesn't just sit on the skin, but pushes through it, down into the bone, down into somewhere that doesn't have a name, but every person who has ever worn handcuffs knows exactly where it is. His palms were flat on the roof of the car. The rain was coming down hard, not in sheets, but in a steady, relentless curtain that had no interest in stopping, that had been falling since sometime around 8 that evening, and showed no signs of negotiating with anyone about when it might let up. And it had already soaked through the shoulders of his charcoal wool suit, through the white dress shirt beneath it, and was now working its way down his back with the patient indifferent efficiency of water that has found its level and intends to stay there. He was a large man, 63 years old, broad across the shoulders, gray at the temples, wearing glasses with silver wire frames that the rain was doing its best to make useless. He was standing on the shoulder of a residential street in a town called Crestwood Heights, hands on the roof of a black Lexus, legs spread apart at a distance that had been established not by him but by the heel of a tactical boot that had kicked his ankles further apart with the casual businesslike force of someone performing a task they have performed many times before. Behind him, a voice, low, flat, carrying the particular texture of a man who has learned that the space between his badge and his mouth requires no justification. The voice was listing charges. Not reading them. There was no clipboard, no paper, no document of any kind, just generating them one after another, with the fluency of improvisation dressed up as procedure, each one landing in the wet air between them like a brick being placed on a scale that had been rigged before either of them arrived. He listened to every word. His hands did not move. His breathing was measured, not the forced, deliberate breathing of someone trying to control panic, but the natural, settled rhythm of a man who had decided somewhere between the moment the lights appeared in his mirror and this moment right now exactly what the next several hours were going to require of him, and had accepted that requirement without drama and without fear. The handcuffs bit into his left wrist, the left one specifically where an old injury from a bicycle accident 13 years ago had left the joint slightly thicker, slightly less forgiving of compression, and the officer behind him had ratcheted the steel down as tight as it would go with the enthusiasm of someone making a point rather than making an arrest. He felt the pressure. He noted it. He did not say anything. The rain drummed against the roof of the Lexus, against the hood, against the wet asphalt that reflected the red and blue pulse of the patrol car's light bar in long, shimmering ribbons, red and blue, over and over like a heartbeat that doesn't know how to slow down. A passing car slowed, then accelerated. The driver had seen something on the shoulder of the road, an older black man in a ruined suit spread against a luxury vehicle, a white officer in tactical gear standing behind him, and had made the calculation that most people make when they see something like that, which is to say, they had decided that whatever was happening was already decided, that the shape of the scene told its own story, and they had driven on. He noticed that too. He noticed everything. The officer's voice kept moving, resisting arrest obstruction failure to maintain lane window tint. Violation stacking one fabrication on top of another with the confidence of a man who had done this before and had never once been asked to account for it. And the man with his palms on the wet roof of his Lexus stood in the rain and listened, and somewhere behind his eyes, behind the measured calm of his expression, something was working. Not rage, not fear, not the particular helpless grief that this kind of night is capable of producing in a person, but something older and colder and more precise than any of those things. He was building a case, in the dark, in the rain, on the side of a road in Crestwood Heights, with his wrists in steel and his suit destroyed, and the night pressing down around him. He was already quietly, methodically building a case. The officer hadn't arrested the right man on the wrong night. He had arrested the wrong man on the last night that anything in his life would ever go the way he expected it to. 4 hours before the handcuffs, the courthouse on Meridian Street had been empty for 40 minutes by the time he finally gathered his papers and switched off the lamp on his desk, and the building had settled into that particular quiet that old courthouses settle into. After hours, not silence exactly, but a kind of acoustic wait, The accumulated hush of thousands of arguments made and decided of, voices raised and lowered, and finally silenced by the gavel of truth and its impersonators taking turns at the podium until someone with the authority to tell the difference finally did. He had been in that building for 11 hours. The case had been a complicated one. Corporate malfeasance, a web of shell companies and falsified contracts that had taken the prosecution 18 months to untangle and would take the jury considerably less time than that to process once they finally got it, because juries in his experience were often better at cutting through complexity than the lawyers presenting it, particularly when the complexity was the point rather than the product. He was tired in the way that 11 hours of concentrated attention makes a person tired, not physically depleted, but mentally scoured the way a pan looks after someone has cleaned it to thoroughly shining and slightly raw. He said goodnight to Robert Deans, the security guard who worked the evening shift and who had been working it for 6 years and whose daughter had just gotten into nursing school. He knew this because he had asked 3 weeks ago and had remembered the answer, which was not a remarkable thing for a person to do, but which Robert Deans always seemed to find slightly surprising, as though the habit of being noticed was not something he had entirely gotten used to. The GPS recalculated as he turned onto the on-ramp. Accident on Interstate 78, significant delays, alternate route suggested Crestwood Heights Millbrook Road reconnect at exit 14. He accepted the reroute without particular feeling. He knew what Crestwood Heights was. He had lived long enough and in enough proximity to enough different versions of American geography to know exactly what a town like Crestwood Heights was, and what it meant for a man who looked like him to be driving through it after 10 o'clock at night in a car that cost more than the average annual salary of the people who lived there. He adjusted his mirrors. He set his speed to 27 miles per hour in a 30-mile-per-hour zone, not because the law required it, but because the unwritten arithmetic of his existence required it, the same arithmetic that had required it when he was a young public defender, driving through counties in the southern part of the state, the same arithmetic that his father had taught him with a quietness that was more instruction than conversation. The kind of quietness that meant this is not fair, and you need to know it, and you need to live in it anyway, and you need to come home. He thought about the bourbon waiting on his kitchen counter. He thought about the novel on his nightstand, a thick, unhurried biography of a man who had spent his life building something careful and lasting, the kind of book that asked nothing of you except that you pay attention. He turned onto Elm Crescent, and in his rearview mirror a pair of headlights moved. His name was Calvin DeRoy Holt, and if you had asked the people who knew him professionally, the lawyers who appeared before him, the marshals who had worked his courtroom for a decade, the clerks who processed his opinions and occasionally stayed late trying to parse the particular precision of his written reasoning. If you had asked any of them to describe him, most of them would have started not with his title or his resume, but with something smaller and more specific, something like the way he listened. Because Calvin Holt listened the way that very few people who have achieved significant authority in any field still bother to listen, not waiting for the thing the speaker was about to say so that he could begin formulating his response, but actually receiving what was being said. Turning it over, testing it, sitting with it long enough to understand not just the argument, but the person making the argument and what it had cost them to make it. He had learned to listen like that a long time ago, not in law school though. Harvard Law had done its part. He had graduated in the top 8% of his class and carried his debt for 7 years afterward, paying it down in installments while working as a public defender in the Cook County system, taking cases that nobody wanted because the people in them couldn't afford to want anything better, and doing that work with a thoroughness that his colleagues found either admirable or exhausting, depending on how much sleep they had gotten the night before. He had grown up on the south side of Chicago, the son of a fifth-grade teacher named Elaine, and an electrician named Walter, both of whom believed with a completeness that left no room for doubt that an education was the one thing in the world that nobody could repossess, and who had built their lives around that belief with the kind of quiet, daily discipline that doesn't make headlines, but makes people. His mother had corrected his grammar at the dinner table not harshly, but consistently, as though precision in language was not a social affectation, but a tool, something you sharpened because it might one day be the thing that stood between you and a verdict you didn't deserve. His father had taught him something else. something that took Calvin longer to understand and that he had turned over in his mind many times in the decades since, something that Walter Holt had communicated less through words than through example, through the specific way he carried himself in certain rooms and around certain people, which was to say with full dignity without apology, and with the complete understanding that dignity and safety are not the same thing. Calvin had spent 7 years in the public defender's office. In those 7 years, he had sat beside men and women, mostly men, mostly young, mostly black, who had been caught in the grinding mechanisms of a justice system that was theoretically designed to protect them and practically designed to process them. And he had done everything the law allowed him to do on their behalf. And sometimes it had been enough, and sometimes it had not. And the cases where it had not been enough had not left him and had never left him, and he did not expect them to. There was one he thought about more than the others, Roy Danforth, 24 years old, a shipping warehouse worker from the West Side, arrested for resisting arrest, which is to say arrested for the act of being arrested, a charge that can only exist if the original arrest is assumed to be valid, which the arresting officer had testified under oath that it was, and which Calvin had spent 3 weeks demonstrating was not, and which the jury had nonetheless accepted because the officer was white and wore a badge, and Calvin's client was 24 years old and black and had been scared in the way that a 24-year-old man in that situation is entitled to be scared, and fear in a courtroom can look like guilt to people who have never had reason to be afraid of the people sworn to protect them. Roy Danforth went to prison for 6 years. Calvin Holt had stood in the hallway of the Cook County Courthouse afterward and made a decision, not a dramatic one, not the kind accompanied by a speech or a moment of visible resolve, just a quiet internal rearrangement. A conclusion arrived at after years of evidence, which was that the bench was where the decisions were made, and that the bench needed people on it who understood what it felt like to stand on the other side of it. He had been a federal judge for 14 years. He had sentenced corporate criminals and corrupt officials and people who had used their authority as a weapon and called it service, and he had done it with the same precision and the same refusal to confuse mercy with the abdication of consequence. And he had done it because he owed it to the job, to the law, and to every Roy Danforth who would never have a federal judge in their corner when the lights went out. Tonight, on the shoulder of a road in Crestwood Heights in the rain, he was just a man. And he was counting on the fact that the officer behind him had not yet understood the difference between what something looks like and what it is. Crestwood Heights was the kind of town that had perfected the architecture of exclusion without ever having to name it. The lawns were maintained with a precision that suggested not just wealth, but the particular anxiety of wealth that needs to be visible. Not a blade of grass out of position, not a leaf on the driveway, not a cracked segment of sidewalk left unaddressed for more than a week before someone's property manager dispatched a crew to grind it smooth. The streetlights were newer here than in the neighborhoods directly adjacent, and there were more of them and they were brighter, which meant that the darkness between them was more deliberate, more managed, not the darkness of neglect, but the darkness of design. The police department budget for Crestwood Heights was per capita 3 times the state average. Officer Brett Kowalski had been sitting in his patrol car in the far corner of the Westfield Commons parking lot, closed since 9, the anchor store having shut its doors permanently 18 months ago, since shortly before 10. The engine idling at a murmur, the heat just barely on his coffee in the cup holder going from warm to cool, with the gradual indifference of things that nobody is attending to. He was 36 years old. He had been on the Crestwood Heights force for 9 years, and in those 9 years he had built for himself a specific and satisfying identity. Not the identity of a cop who responded to crimes that had already happened, but the identity of a cop who prevented them, which in practice meant something very particular, which was that he patrolled the borders of his town with the vigilance of a man protecting something that could be taken from him, and that the thing he was protecting was not safety in any abstract sense, but a specific version of order, a specific set of assumptions about who belonged, where, and what it meant when someone appeared where they weren't expected. He had received 3 formal complaints in 9 years. All 3 had been reviewed internally. All 3 had been ruled unfounded. The first had come from a 41-year-old man named Harold Briggs, who had been a contractor doing licensed renovation work on a property on Sycamore Lane, and whom Kowalski had stopped, questioned, and detained for 45 minutes on the basis of a suspicious vehicle, a white work van with Briggs Construction stenciled on the side in letters large enough to read from 30 feet. The second had come from a woman named Diane Moseley, 60 years old, visiting her daughter who lived on Peachtree Court, who had been stopped twice in the same evening on her way in and out of the neighborhood, and asked both times for identification and to explain her purpose for being there. The third complaint had involved a physical altercation that Kowalski's report described as necessary force in response to active resistance, and that the complainant, a 26-year-old man named Terrence Waits, who had been walking from a bus stop to his girlfriend's apartment, described somewhat differently. All three complaints had been reviewed by an internal board that consisted of 3 officers, one of whom was Kowalski's shift supervisor. All 3 had been ruled unfounded. Kowalski knew what that meant. Not that he had done nothing wrong. He was not naive enough to believe that, and he was not the kind of man who spent much time in conversation with his own conscience in any case, but that the distance between what he did and what he was held accountable for was wide enough to move freely in, and that as long as he stayed within the architecture of that distance, the world would continue to organize itself in his favor. The black Lexus came around the corner of Elm Crescent at 10:47 p.m. Kowalski saw it from 50 yards, and he sat forward in the seat, and the particular alertness that came over him in these moments was not fear and was not caution. It was appetite, specific and familiar, the appetite of a man who has identified what he considers prey. The car was clean. Too clean in the way that Kowalski had trained himself to process as information. A luxury vehicle moving through his sector at this hour with those plates driven by a silhouette that he had already categorized in the half-second of its appearance had no explanation that his worldview was willing to accept as legitimate. He shifted the cruiser into drive. The headlights appeared in Calvin's rearview mirror at 10:47 p.m. He noted the time the way he had been noting things his entire professional life, not with alarm, but with the quiet, practiced accuracy of a man who understood that the reconstruction of events depended on the precision of the person present for them. That memory is only as good as the attention that created it, and that the law rewards the witness who can say exactly what happened and exactly when. He had been in courtrooms for 35 years. He had watched cases won and lost on the difference between around midnight and 10:47 p.m. The headlights stayed with him through the turn onto Millbrook Road. He checked his speedometer, 27 miles per hour. He checked his lane position centered with appropriate margins on both sides. He checked his signal on well in advance of each turn held long enough to be unambiguous. His hands were at 10 and 2 on the steering wheel, not because he was nervous, but because he had driven this way for 40 years, because Walter Holt had taught him to drive with both hands on the wheel, the same way he had taught him everything else, which was to say with the understanding that the world would be watching, and that the watching was never neutral. He reached into the pocket of his vest with his right hand slowly, deliberately, and touched the surface of his phone. He did not call anyone. He did not send a message. What he did was this. He held the phone in his palm for 3 seconds, pressed the side button twice in quick succession, and then returned it to his pocket because the model he carried had a function that he had never used for this purpose before, but that he was using now, which was a silent timestamp feature that logged location time and a brief audio marker to a secure cloud. Backup, a feature he had read about 6 months ago in a technology review that a law clerk had left on his desk and which he had filed away in the back of his mind as a small, precise tool for a situation he had hoped would never arrive. 10:47 p.m. Millbrook Road, Crestwood Heights. He was a witness to himself now. The lights in the mirror were closer. He kept his speed exactly where it was not slowing, not accelerating, not changing his behavior in any way that could be construed as reactive. Because a man who has spent 14 years evaluating the behavior of other people in high-pressure situations understands that behavior is evidence that every deviation from the ordinary is a sentence in the story that gets reconstructed afterward. He drove ordinarily. He was not ordinary. But tonight, ordinarily was the most powerful thing he had to offer. The light bar on the cruiser behind him erupted red and blue, filling the inside of his car with that particular quality of manufactured urgency, that visual language that says, "Stop now. This is authority. This is power. This is not negotiable." He let out a breath. Not a sigh of fear, not a gasp of surprise, just a breath measured, deliberate. The kind that a person takes when they have reached the beginning of something they already know is going to be long and hard and necessary, and have decided to meet it on their own terms. He pulled the Lexus to the shoulder beneath a streetlight, deliberately choosing the lit section, not the dark stretch 20 feet further along. He shifted into park. He turned off the engine. He rolled down the window, and he placed both hands flat on the top of the steering wheel at 10 and 2. And he waited with the patience of a man who had been waiting for various versions of this moment his entire life, and who had somewhere along the way made peace with the fact that waiting did not mean accepting it, meant knowing when to move. Kowalski took his time getting out of the cruiser. This was deliberate. The delay was part of a choreography that he had refined over 9 years, a sequence of actions designed not for safety but for dominance. Because the first thing you established in a traffic stop in his understanding of traffic stops was who was waiting on whom, and the person waiting was never the person in control. He adjusted his duty belt. He unclipped the retention strap on his holster, not because he had any reasonable belief that the man in the Lexus was armed, but because the sound of it and the gesture of it communicated something that he wanted communicated, which was that the option existed and that the option was his. He picked up his tactical flashlight, a long, heavy aluminum model that threw a beam wide and bright enough to function as a light source and an instrument of disorientation simultaneously, and he walked toward the driver's side door of the Lexus with the measured, unhurried pace of a man who owns the road he is walking on. He aimed the light directly into Calvin's side mirror before he reached the window. This was not accidental. The mirror bounced the beam back into Calvin's eyes, not bright enough to cause injury, but bright enough to deprive him of the ability to see Kowalski clearly, which was again the point, because a man who cannot see your face, cannot read your expression, cannot track your movements, cannot gather the information that a person naturally gathers when they are trying to assess a situation, which meant that Kowalski had, in a single tactical movement, reduced Calvin's situational awareness while maximizing his own. Calvin blinked once. Then he adjusted his gaze forward and waited. "Evening," Kowalski said. His voice was flat, not unfriendly exactly, but with no warmth in it at all, carrying the specific register of authority that has no interest in being liked, and no awareness that likability might be relevant. He kept the flashlight in Calvin's eyes. "Good evening, officer," Calvin said. Calvin. His voice was what it always was, a deep, smooth baritone that carried the kind of unhurried steadiness that comes not from performing calm, but from having over a long period of time genuinely arrived at it. Kowalski's jaw tightened slightly. He had expected something different. Most people, he stopped exhibited at least a trace of the thing that his presence was designed to produce, which was a particular quality of nervous deference, a readiness to apologize for whatever they might have done, a willingness to be smaller. This man was offering him none of that, and the absence of it registered in Kowalski's body before it registered in his mind, a slight tightening in the chest, a heat at the back of the neck. "Do you know why I stopped you tonight?" Kowalski asked. "I confess, I do not." Calvin said the construction of the sentence, I confess, precise and slightly formal in a way that Kowalski clocked immediately without being able to articulate why it bothered him. "I was traveling under the posted speed limit, my registration is current, and my vehicle is in complete working order. I would appreciate if you could explain the basis for this stop." Kowalski's eyes swept the interior of the Lexus. He was looking for something, anything that could be elevated into probable cause, the legal threshold that his law school-educated brain knew he needed, and that his 9 years of practice had taught him to construct from available materials, regardless of what those materials actually were. The interior was immaculate. A leather briefcase on the passenger seat. Legal documents visible through the half-open flap papers with dense formatting the look of court documents. A Mont Blanc pen in the cup holder. A dry cleaning bag hung carefully from the hook above the rear window. Nothing. "You swerved back there," Kowalski said. failure to maintain your lane, and your window tint looks dark, possibly over the legal limit. Calvin paused for exactly one beat. I did not swerve, officer. I have been traveling in a straight line at 27 miles per hour since I entered Crestwood Heights. With respect to the window tint, this is a factory standard installation on a 2018 model which is well within the legal parameters for this state. I am happy to provide the manufacturer's documentation if that would be useful. The words landed with the quiet precision of someone who is not arguing, who is specifically and deliberately not arguing, but who is also not conceding a single syllable of ground. Kowalski's face did not change, but something in his breathing did. Where are you headed tonight? I am heading home. The interstate was closed due to an accident and my navigation system routed me through Crestwood Heights. I am simply passing through. Passing through. Kowalski repeated the phrase internally, turning it over, and found that it struck him with a quality that was not quite offense but was adjacent to it. The suggestion that this town was a place a person of this description could simply pass through without explanation, without accountability, as though their presence here were no different from the presence of anyone else. License and registration, Kowalski said. Of course. My license is in my left interior jacket pocket. My registration and proof of insurance are in the glove compartment. With your permission, I will reach for them now. Go ahead. Calvin's movements were slow, precise, and narrated not the narration of a guilty person trying to telegraph innocence, but the narration of a person who understood that in a traffic stop in the dark in a town with the reputation this town had every movement needed, a verbal accompaniment, not because the officer deserved that courtesy, but because the recording devices, the dash cam that he knew was running the systems he suspected were running, needed it. He extended the license and registration. Kowalski took them. He looked at the license. The name meant nothing to him. The address was not in this neighborhood. It was in a well-regarded part of the city 40 minutes east, an address that suggested a certain kind of financial stability that did not in Kowalski's taxonomy square with the demographic in front of him. He looked at the license for longer than he needed to. Then he looked at Calvin. Then he looked back at the license. Wait here, he said, and returned to the cruiser. He ran the plates. Clean. He ran the license. Clean. No priors, no warrants, no flags of any kind. He sat in the cruiser for 3 minutes. He was not calling anything in. He was deciding. And what he decided, sitting alone in the warm interior of his patrol car while the rain drummed on the roof and a 63-year-old federal judge waited with his hands on the steering wheel, was that the absence of a legitimate reason was not a reason to let this go. It was a reason to find one. He came back to the window with a different energy. The energy of a decision made, of a course locked in, of the particular momentum that builds in a person once they have committed to something and stopped asking themselves whether they should. Step out of the vehicle. Calvin's response was measured and immediate. Officer, I want to be cooperative. Under Pennsylvania versus Mims, you do have the legal authority to order me from the vehicle during a traffic stop for officer safety purposes. However, I have been entirely compliant throughout this encounter. My hands have not moved from the steering wheel, and I have provided all requested documentation without incident. I want to ask respectfully whether this order is based on a specific safety concern, or whether we are in the process of escalating a stop for which no legitimate probable cause has been established. The sentence was not a speech. It was not a challenge. It was a question asked in a voice that was completely, unshakably, maddeningly calm, and Kowalski felt the flush move up his neck before he had processed the specific content of the words, because the content was almost secondary to the texture of it, to the way the man in the car was speaking to him. Not as a person speaks to a police officer during a traffic stop, but as a person speaks to an argument they have already evaluated and found wanting. Out of the vehicle. Now. He reached his left hand to the holster. The taser came out with the smooth, practiced motion of 9 years of muscle memory, and the red laser dot appeared on the front of Calvin's suit, sitting perfectly still against the charcoal wool. A small, steady point of light that meant something very specific, and that both men in that moment understood completely. Calvin looked at it. He looked at the dot, and then he looked at the officer's face, and what he saw in the officer's face was not the controlled alertness of a professional responding to a threat, but something rawer and less manageable than that. Something that looked like anger, wearing the mask of authority, which is among the most dangerous things that a person with a badge and a weapon can bring to a roadside encounter. He had presided over the wrongful death suits. He had watched the dash cam footage in chambers alone on the small monitor above his credenza of men who had looked at officers with expressions less confrontational than his and had not driven home afterward. He had read the depositions. He knew how this particular script ended if he didn't make the choice that he made now, which was to comply completely, visibly narrating every movement as he made it, because compliance was not surrender, and it was not defeat. It was strategy. It was the deliberate conversion of a moment of danger into a documented record. "I am complying," Calvin said, his voice carrying a quality that was neither anger nor fear, but something that fell between them like a third thing that had no common name. "I am turning off the ignition. I am unbuckling my seatbelt. I am placing my right hand on the door handle. I am opening the door." He stepped out into the rain. The cold hit him immediately, not the abstract cold of November, but the specific saturating cold of water that has been falling for hours, and that finds the collar of a jacket and the gap above the shoe with the efficiency of something that has been waiting for exactly this opportunity. He stood at his full height, 6 feet 2 inches. He did not hunch, did not round his shoulders, did not make himself smaller, in the way that people sometimes make themselves smaller in the presence of power they don't want to provoke. He stood, and Kowalski, who was 5 feet 11 and who had spent the last 45 minutes in the position of complete physical and institutional authority, looked up at him, and something moved in the officer's face that was not quite recalibration and not quite recognition, and was gone almost before it arrived. "Turn around, hands on the roof, spread your legs." Calvin turned slowly without rush and placed both palms flat on the wet roof of his Lexus. The search found nothing. This was not a surprise to Calvin, and should not have been a surprise to Kowalski, but Kowalski conducted it with the escalating thoroughness of a man who was increasingly invested in the outcome, whose hands moved across Calvin's jacket with the aggressive efficiency of someone who needed to find something badly enough that the not finding had begun to feel personal. Nothing in the jacket pocket's keys, a folded handkerchief, a pen. Nothing at the waistband. Nothing in the trouser pockets. The briefcase was on the passenger seat. Kowalski reached in and opened it without asking. Moving the legal papers with his flashlight beam, finding more papers. Finding a leather-bound appointment book. Finding a laminated card with a federal court seal that he looked at for a moment, and then set aside with the focused incuriosity of a man whose conclusion is already fixed and who has no use for evidence that argues against it. He stepped back. "Where are the drugs?" he said close to Calvin's ear. "There are no drugs." Calvin set his voice low and steady over the sound of the rain against the roof of the car. "There are no weapons, and there is no stolen property. You are conducting a search without probable cause and without my consent, which constitutes a violation of my rights under the Fourth Amendment of the United States Constitution." "I don't need your consent," Kowalski said, and grabbed Calvin's arms. The movement was sharp, sudden twisting applied with more force than the mechanics of handcuffing require, and the torque of it caught Calvin's left shoulder at an angle that sent a bright, specific line of pain from the joint down to the elbow and up into the side of the neck. And Calvin gritted his teeth against it, and he did not cry out, and he did not struggle because struggling was not available to him as an option, in the same way that it might not be available to someone who is playing a long game and knows that the short game is already lost. The cuffs went on. Kowalski ratcheted them tighter than function required, tighter than policy permitted, the steel cutting into the skin and pressing on the nerve with the intimate deliberateness of someone making a point about what their authority can reach. Calvin felt the numbness begin in his fingers. He noted it. "I'm taking you in," Kowalski said, close behind him, his breath carrying the stale warmth of hours-old coffee. "You want to act like you know the law, you can do it from a cell. You're under arrest." "For what crime?" Calvin asked. "Resisting a lawful order. Obstruction. I'll think of a few more on the drive over." And then Kowalski laughed, a short, compressed sound that carried within it all the confidence of a man who has never once in 9 years faced a consequence for any of the things he has done. He grabbed Calvin by the collar of his jacket and began moving him toward the cruiser. And as he did, he talked. The words came out with the fluency of long-held conviction, finally given air about people like you, coming into his sector, about knowing their place, about what happened to men who thought that talking like a lawyer made them untouchable, about the DA, about felony charges, about prison time, about a concrete box for 3 years. And then, midway between the Lexus and the cruiser in the rain, with steel on his wrists and pain in his shoulder and his suit destroyed, Calvin. Holt stopped walking. Not dramatically. Not as a gesture of defiance. He simply planted his feet on the wet asphalt and turned his head, and he looked at Brett Kowalski with the full, undivided attention of a man who had spent 14 years in a room where looking at someone was an act of meaning. He let the rain fall. He let the silence hold for exactly 3 seconds. And then he said in a voice so quiet that Kowalski had to stop moving just to hear it. A voice that had no anger in it, and no fear, and no performance of any kind. Just the flat, precise authority of a statement being delivered by someone who has complete confidence in its accuracy. Officer Kowalski, I want you to remember every single thing you have done tonight. Every word, every choice, because I am going to remember them too, and I promise you that before the sun rises tomorrow morning, the life you know will be entirely over. Kowalski stopped. For 3 seconds, not long, not dramatic, not enough for anyone watching to describe as significant, he stopped. And in those 3 seconds, something passed through the back of his mind that was not quite a warning and not quite a fear, but was the faint animal-level recognition that something had gone wrong in a way he hadn't yet identified a pattern. Interrupt in the structure of how these nights were supposed to go. Then 9 years of unchallenged certainty swallowed it. He shoved Calvin hard toward the cruiser. Calvin's head striking the metal doorframe with a sound that was sharp and specific and that Kowalski did not acknowledge, and the rear door slammed shut, and the silence inside the police car was total and dark and smelled of disinfectant and old upholstery. And something underneath, that something harder to name. Something like the accumulated weight of every other person who had been placed in this seat against their will. Calvin leaned his head back. He closed his eyes. The windshield wipers swept 1-2, 1-2, 1-2. He listened to them. He was not counting time, he was letting it pass the way a person who has placed a bet lets the hand play out, knowing that the result was determined before the cards were turned. He sat in the dark, and he waited. And outside the rain kept falling, and the cruiser moved through the empty streets of Crestwood Heights, and Officer Brett Kowalski drove and thought about how the story he was going to write in his report was already composing itself clean and complete and utterly self-serving. And he had no idea, not a single cell of awareness, that every word he had said in the last 20 minutes had been traveling in real time to a server he would never be able to touch. The precinct was the kind of building that expressed its purpose without trying to all hard surfaces and institutional lighting. The kind of lighting that was designed not to comfort, but to reveal fluorescent tubes that turned everyone who stood under them a uniform shade of slightly worse than they actually were, that made the skin look waxy and the eyes look tired and removed the social softening that natural light provides, leaving behind only function. At 11:15 at night, the precinct was quiet in the way that overnight shifts are quiet, not empty, but pared down. Operating at the level of maintenance rather than production. A skeleton crew of dispatchers and desk officers and the occasional patrol unit cycling in and out. The hum of vending machines providing the building's ambient score, punctuated by the crackle of radio dispatch and the sporadic rhythm of someone's keyboard. The floors were granite. Real granite, pale gray with darker veins buffed to a shine that you could see yourself in if you looked down at the right angle. Which was not an accident. The city council had approved the renovation budget 6 years ago, and the building committee had chosen granite for reasons that had more to do with what it communicated about the town's self-image than what it communicated about policing. Sergeant Frank Dolan was behind the booking desk. He was 57 years old, thick through the middle in the way of men who spent most of their working life sitting with gray hair cut close and reading glasses perched at the end of a nose that had been broken twice, once in a bar fight in his 20s, and once from walking into an open filing cabinet drawer at age 44, which was the one he was more embarrassed about. 29 years on the force. 2 years until his pension was fully vested and he could retire to the house in the Finger Lakes that his wife had been designing in her imagination for the better part of a decade. He had seen almost everything. Not everything. No honest cop says everything. But enough of the range of human behavior under stress that he had developed what he privately called his wrong note. Instinct. A sense that activated not through logic but through accumulated pattern recognition when something in front of him didn't fit the music of what it claimed to be. The wrong note sounded the moment Kowalski pushed Calvin Holt through the double doors. It wasn't the suit, though the suit was visible even soaking wet as something that cost more than a Crestwood Heights traffic stop typically produced. It wasn't the age or the bearing or even the specific quality of stillness in the man's face that made it look less like a man being brought somewhere against his will, and more like a man who had decided to allow himself to be brought somewhere and was keeping his own account of the journey. It was the eyes. Frank Dolan looked at Calvin Holt over the top of his reading glasses, and Calvin Holt looked back at him not with defiance, not with the searching, desperate look of a man hoping someone will intervene. Not with the defeated look of a man who knows no one. Will just with a complete, clear level regard that said, without words, that he was watching and he was counting and he was fine. Dolan had not seen eyes like that across his booking desk in 29 years. He reached for the intake form. He did not pick up his pen. The booking process had a rhythm. It was the same rhythm. It had always been the same questions in the same order, the same boxes on the same form. The architecture of official procedure designed to reduce a person to a set of answerable variables and then file them accordingly. Kowalski was driving the rhythm with the energy of a man who had completed a task and was now in the comfortable stage of processing the paperwork, leaning on the edge of the desk. Arms crossed, describing the stop in the flat, confident shorthand of someone who is not worried about what's on the record because what's on the record is what they're putting there. Calvin stood at the desk. The cuffs had been moved to the front, which was marginally better. His left wrist was red where the steel had bitten in the skin, raised and tender in a stripe about a quarter-inch wide. He waited for the form to be presented. Then, when Dolan looked up, he said, "I'd like to request access to an attorney. That is my right under Miranda, and I want the request documented." "Sure," Dolan said, writing it down. "Thank you. I would also like to know the formal procedure for filing a complaint against an officer in this department. Specifically, I'd like to know who reviews those complaints, what the timeline is, and whether the process is internal or whether there's an external oversight option." The room went slightly quiet in the way that rooms go quiet when something unexpected has been introduced into the ambient noise. Dolan looked at him. He wrote down the question. "And I want to note for the record, Officer Kowalski's badge number 4417, and your badge number, Sergeant, which I can see from here as 2203. I am not recording these as any kind of threat, Sergeant. I'm recording them because they are relevant facts about this encounter, and I keep records of relevant facts. That's something I've been doing for a long time." He said it without heat. He said it the way a person states a policy. "This is what I do. It is not about you personally. It is about accuracy." Frank Dolan put his pen down. He looked at Calvin for a long moment. In 29 years, not one person who had come through that door under the circumstances described on this intake form had asked about complaint procedures. Not one. They had begged, bargained, threatened, wept, raged, and gone silent. But not one of them had asked about the process for external oversight with the calm, clinical precision of someone who already knew the answer and was asking for the documentation. He picked his pen back up. He wrote something on the form that was not part of the standard intake. Then he looked at Kowalski, who was refilling his coffee from the communal pot behind the desk. His back turned, his posture carrying the full weight of a man who has stopped worrying about this and moved on. Dolan looked back at Calvin. Something was crystallizing in him that was not quite suspicion and not quite certainty, but was moving toward one of them, and he was old enough and experienced enough to know that when it finished crystallizing whatever it turned out to be, he was going to have to decide what to do with it. He excused himself. Meanwhile, in the break room at the end of the corridor, Officer Brett Kowalski was explaining his night to Officer Danny Reeves. Danny Reeves was 26 years old and 7 months into his first posting, which meant that he was in the specific uncomfortable position of having enough experience to understand the gap between what he had been trained to believe about the job and what the job actually was, but not enough experience to know what to do with that understanding, or whether doing anything with it was even an option. He was heating pasta in the microwave. Kowalski was sitting on the break room table, not at it on it the way that people sit when they're comfortable enough in a space to treat the furniture like an extension of themselves. He told the story. He told it the way people tell stories they're proud of, with the editing that makes the teller look larger and the other person look smaller. The pretextual stop, presented as instinct, rewarded the fabricated charges, presented as professional discretion. The resistance presented as exactly the kind of behavior that justified the response it received. He said the man had been giving him lip. He said that people who drove through his sector needed to understand that they were in his sector. He said he was going to talk to the DA about the felony charge, want to see him sweat in county lockup for the weekend. And Danny Reeves stood at the microwave and watched the plate rotate and did not say anything. And the thing he did not say was building up behind his teeth like pressure, and he thought about the man he had seen briefly from the doorway of the precinct. The composed, ruined suit figure being walked to the booking desk, and the way that figure had looked, and the way it did not match any of the shapes that the story Kowalski was telling was trying to fit it into. He took his pasta out of the microwave. He said, "Yeah," and he went back to his desk. Raymond Pruitt was a man who had made a long career out of managing the space between what was happening and what people were allowed to know was happening, and he had gotten so good at this over so many years that the management had become instinctive, not conscious calculation, but reflex, the way an experienced driver adjusts to road conditions without narrating the adjustment to themselves. He had been asleep for 40 minutes when the phone went off. He was 54 years old, and sleep had not been easy for him in recent years. Not because of a troubled conscience exactly, but because of the specific vigilance that accumulates in a person who has spent decades in political proximity to things that could go wrong at any time, a vigilance that never fully stood down even when he told it to. He fumbled for the phone. The screen said Dolan. Desk. Dolan did not call at this hour. Dolan called during business hours about things that required his attention. Dolan calling at 11:30 at night meant something outside the ordinary, and the ordinary was the only category that Raymond Pruitt was comfortable managing. He answered. He listened. At first he listened with the half-attention of someone still processing the transition from sleep to wakefulness, filling in the blanks of Dolan's careful measured sentences with the standard template for a late-night call from the desk sergeant, a situation, a name, a request for guidance. Then Dolan said the name. Calvin Holt. Raymond Pruitt had been an investigator for the state attorney's office for a decade before he took the chief's position, and in that decade he had moved through enough of the regional justice system to understand its geography, who held what, who connected to what, which names had weight, and which names had only the appearance of weight. Calvin Holt had weight. Not the social weight of celebrity or the political weight of elected office, but the specific structural weight of a federal judge who had been on the bench for 14 years, and who had presided over cases that other judges had avoided, and who had a reputation among prosecutors and defense attorneys alike for a standard of procedural accountability that had no tolerance for the kind of creativity that produced outcomes at the expense of process. He was the judge who had presided over the Corvello case, a case that had ended the careers of 3 city council members and a deputy police commissioner in a neighboring county, and that had sent 7 men to prison for a combined 43 years. He was the judge who had held 2 federal agents in contempt for submitting a warrant that contained material misrepresentations. Calvin Holt was not someone you arrested on a pretextual traffic stop. Calvin Holt was not someone you put in a holding cell with cuffs that cut into his wrists. Calvin Holt was not someone whose car you left on the side of a road with the flashers on. Pruitt was out of bed before Dolan finished the sentence. He moved through his house with the urgent, graceless efficiency of a man in the grip of something much larger than a normal emergency. Not the emergency of a thing going wrong, but the emergency of a thing already gone wrong in a way that could not be made to go unwrong, that was already in motion, already accumulating, already building its own record. He threw a coat over his pajama shirt. He pushed bare feet into loafers. He was in his car and moving before he had fully registered the cold. The precinct looked different to Pruitt when he pushed through the double doors at 11:52 p.m. Not physically different, but atmospherically, in the way that a room looks different when you enter it, knowing that something in it is going to change the rest of your life. He took in the scene in the first 3 seconds. Kowalski at the corridor entrance. A fresh coffee in his hand uniform shirt changed into a dry one expression carrying the satisfied completeness of a man who has finished his work for the evening. Dolan at the desk watching, and Calvin Holt on the waiting bench against the wall. Sitting, upright, his ruined suit still soaking wet. His left wrist bearing the red stripe of the cuff. A paper cup of water that Dolan had provided sitting on the bench beside him, and his expression utterly, absolutely unreadable. The expression of a man who had been waiting long enough to have finished all his impatience and was now simply present. Pruitt crossed the room without speaking to anyone else. He stopped in front of Calvin. He removed his hat. The apology that came out of him was not the polished crisis-managed apology of an administrator in damage control. It was the raw, barely coherent apology of a man who understood the size of what had happened and had not yet found a container large enough to hold it, tumbling out in fragments. Your Honor, I cannot begin. This is a catastrophic. I am profoundly, deeply. There are no words. Calvin let it finish. Then he stood. He was taller than Pruitt by 4 inches, and when he stood, his gaze went past the chief, went to the corridor entrance where Kowalski was standing with the coffee cup at half-mast. The expression on his face processing the sequence of events in front of him with the specific dawning quality of a person who has just realized that the floor beneath them is not the floor they thought it was. Calvin looked at Kowalski for exactly 3 seconds. He did not speak to him. He did not need to. Then he looked back at Pruitt, and when he spoke, his voice was the quiet, deliberate voice of a man who has made a decision that he has no intention of revisiting. Chief Pruitt, I appreciate the apology. I do not want a ride home. I do not want the charges dropped quietly. I do not want an internal review conducted by the same department that generated those charges. What I want is for you to place a call to the FBI field office right now tonight and to tell them that a federal judge was illegally detained, physically assaulted, and subjected to racially motivated harassment under color of law by an officer of this department. That call needs to happen in the next 10 minutes. After that, I will wait. Pruitt swallowed. What if I told you we could handle this internally? That Gallagher, that Kowalski would be disciplined appropriately, that... Then I would tell you that the last 3 complaints filed against Officer Kowalski were also handled internally. Calvin said, and the room went very quiet because nobody had expected him to know that, and the fact that he knew it meant something about how long and how carefully he had been paying attention. And I would suggest that the outcome of that process speaks for itself. Make the call, Chief Pruitt, please. Pruitt made the call. Special Agent Dara Osei arrived at 1:34 a.m. She came through the precinct doors with 2 agents flanking her. Not the dramatic entrance of television procedurals. No drawn weapons, no raised voices. Just 3 people in dark suits walking at the measured pace of people who are not in a hurry because hurrying implies that the outcome is in question, and the outcome was not in question. Osei was 44 years old, and she had the particular quality of stillness that comes to people who have spent a long time in the business of finding out what actually happened. A stillness that was not passivity but its opposite. The concentrated readiness of someone for whom observation is a professional practice and who has long since stopped burning energy on display. She looked at the room. She looked at Kowalski in the corridor, registered him, classified him, moved on. She looked at Pruitt, who had straightened up and was now attempting the composure of an institutional authority figure with limited success. And she looked at Calvin. One small, specific nod, not familiarity, not warmth, but the particular acknowledgement of one professional to another in a situation that both of them understood completely. She turned to Pruitt. "Agent Osei, FBI," she said. "I'm taking jurisdiction of this facility. My agents will be securing your server room and preserving all digital evidence dispatch logs, vehicle systems, body cam records, booking documentation. Nothing leaves this building, and nothing is altered. Do you understand?" "Yes," Pruitt said. Then, with the instinct of 25 years of crisis management, Agent Osei. "I want to be clear that the department is fully cooperative, that we view this as an isolated incident, and that the officer involved has already been—" "We'll get to the officer," Osei said. Not unkindly, just finally. She walked to the server room. Kowalski had not moved from the corridor entrance. He was still holding the coffee cup. The coffee had been cold for half an hour. The server room took 12 minutes. When Osei's tech agent came out, he was carrying a tablet, and the expression on his face was not surprise. Federal agents are trained out of surprise early in their careers, but it was something adjacent to satisfaction. The specific expression of a person who has just confirmed a thing they suspected and found the confirmation more complete than they expected. They gathered in the main room of the precinct. Osei connected the tablet to the wall-mounted display above the booking desk. The dash cam footage came up first. High-definition, wide-angle array, rendering the night both more dramatic and more specific than memory alone, would have the black Lexus sitting perfectly still on the shoulder of Millbrook Road wheels. Straight driver's hands visible through the window at 10 and 2. The car positioned under the streetlight in a way that when you saw it made the precision of the choice obvious to anyone paying attention. The footage showed every approach Kowalski made. The deliberate flashlight into mirror. The unhurried walk. The hand on the holster. The full sequence of the stop unedited in real time without the organizing logic of a police report to tell you what you were supposed to be seeing. Just what was there, which was a man doing everything right and an officer doing everything wrong. Then, Osei's agent said, "Body cam is empty." He manually powered it down before exiting the vehicle. The room absorbed this. Pruitt closed his eyes briefly. Because in the room, everyone who wore a badge understood what that meant. What the turning off of the body cam right before the stop, right before the encounter, meant about premeditation. About consciousness of what was coming, about the gap between what Kowalski had reported and what Kowalski had intended. "Chief Pruitt," Osei said, her voice carrying the quality of deceptive quiet that is actually its own kind of loudness. "Your department accepted a Department of Justice infrastructure grant last October. Part of that grant funded the installation of the Axon Fleet 3 vehicle system in your patrol fleet." Pruitt nodded slowly. "What most departments don't read carefully in the implementation documentation," Osei continued, her tech agent tapping on the tablet as she spoke, "is the federal redundancy protocol that comes standard with that system. The moment a patrol vehicle activates its light bar for an enforcement stop, a dual microphone array inside the cabin begins recording. The system syncs with the officer's lapel mic via encrypted Bluetooth. It uploads continuously to a federal cloud server that your IT department cannot access or modify. The officer's body cam can be powered down. The dashboard display can be disabled. None of it affects the cabin recording, which runs from the moment the lights go on until the vehicle is returned to the motor pool and the shift ends." She looked at Kowalski. "He didn't know about it," one of the precinct officers said quietly from somewhere near the wall. "No," Osei said. "He did not." The audio began. In the silence of the precinct at 2 a.m, in the fluorescent-lit, granite-floored vending machine humming silence of a building that was about to become significant in the record of a federal case, the voice of Brett Kowalski filled the room. It was clear. It was complete. Every word of it. The fabricated lane violation. The invented tint concern. The demand that a fully compliant man exit his vehicle. The pat-down. The tightened cuffs. The specific ugly phrases people like you, city trash, don't get smart with me boy, delivered in the confident tone of a man who believed he was alone with a person who had no recourse. The felony threat. The prison time. And then the recording caught something else. The sharp specific impact sound of a man's head hitting a metal door frame, followed by the slam of the rear door. The audio ended. Nobody spoke. Danny Reeves, standing near the far wall, was looking at the floor. The wife of one of the other overnight officers who had stopped in at around 11 to drop off a forgotten dinner had left the building at some point during the playback. Nobody had noticed exactly when. Kowalski had not moved, but the coffee cup was no longer in his hand. At some point it had left his grip entirely, and it was on the granite floor in a spreading pool of cold brown liquid, and he had not bent to pick it up, and he appeared to not have noticed, and the small, spilled, spreading stillness of it was somehow among the most specific things in the room. "Agent Reyes," Osei said, addressing one of the agents who had come in with her, "please proceed to the officer and place him under federal arrest. The charges are deprivation of rights under color of law, that's 18 U.S.C., Section 242, aggravated assault, obstruction of justice, and falsification of official records. Read him his Miranda rights. Document everything he says." It didn't happen all at once the way dramatic things in films happen. It happened the way real things happen in pieces, in the ordinary sequential movements of people performing a procedure, and the ordinariness of it was somehow worse than drama would have been, because it stripped away any narrative that could have made Kowalski seem like someone to whom this was happening, rather than someone who had built action by action the room he was now standing in. The agent walked toward him. Kowalski's hands came up not in resistance, but in the automatic gesture of a man whose body is performing the motions of compliance while his mind is still somewhere 3 steps back, still in the break room telling Danny Reeves about the stop, still in the comfortable story of an evening that had gone the way his evenings went. His wrists came together. The cuffs went on. Click, click. The sound in the precinct was the same sound, the same pitch, the same metallic click of a ratchet mechanism engaging as the sound on the recording, as the sound on Millbrook Road, as the sound that Calvin Holt had noted in the dark of the rear seat while the windshield wipers counted. It was the same sound, in a different direction. Kowalski walked toward the door, not being dragged, not struggling, just walking. Looking at the floor? The way a person looks at the floor when the alternative is looking at the room, at the faces at the booking desk he had stood behind for 9 years with his name badge on and his coffee in hand and his absolute certainty that the architecture of this building would always organize itself around his convenience. Calvin stood near the booking desk. He watched. His expression was the same expression it had been all night, the one that had no name in the ordinary catalog of reactions because it wasn't any of the expected things. It wasn't triumph or satisfaction or relief. It was something more like the specific, quiet recognition that comes when the world confirms something you already knew. And the confirmation is less satisfying than you expected it to be, because the thing that was confirmed was not a good thing about the world. He watched until Kowalski was through the door. Then he looked down at his wrists. At some point around 3 a.m, after the agents had finished their preliminary work in the server room and Kowalski had been transported and Pruitt was somewhere in the building composing the most important phone call of his career, the precinct settled into a new kind of quiet. Not the comfortable overnight shift quiet of earlier in the evening, but the quiet of a building that has been changed by what happened in it and hasn't yet figured out what it is now. Dolan made coffee. He brought a mug to Calvin, who had declined the offer to sit somewhere more comfortable with the polite firmness of a man who had his own reasons for staying where he was. They sat at the booking desk together, Dolan on his side, Calvin on the bench nearby, and for a while neither of them said anything because there was no pressure to fill the silence and because both of them were in different ways still processing the night. Eventually, Calvin asked in a voice that was genuinely curious rather than accusatory, "The 3 complaints. You knew about them." Dolan looked at his coffee. "I knew? You processed the paperwork." "I processed the paperwork." A pause. "What was different tonight?" Dolan was quiet for a long moment, long enough that Calvin thought he might not answer. or might give an answer that was really a deflection, the kind of answer that experienced bureaucrats learn to produce when they need to say something without saying anything. But then Dolan looked up, and the expression on his face was one that a person produces when they've been carrying something for a while and have unexpectedly found themselves with both hands free. "Because tonight I looked at you before I knew who you were," he said. "And what I saw was a man who hadn't done anything wrong. And I've looked at a lot of people come through that door, and I know the difference, and I knew the difference tonight, and I put down my pen and I made a call. That's all." He looked back at his coffee. "The other 3 times I told myself I was trusting the process. I told myself it wasn't my call. I told myself somebody else was looking at it." He set the mug down on the desk. Nobody else was looking at it. Calvin sat with that for a while. Outside, the rain had slowed to something barely present, more atmosphere than weather. Now a fine, persistent mist that you could convince yourself wasn't really rain at all if you were determined enough to. He thought about Roy Danforth. He thought about Roy Danforth the way he had thought about Roy Danforth hundreds of times over 30 years. Not with guilt, which had come and gone in the early years, but with a kind of structural awareness. The way you're aware of a weight that you've been carrying long enough to stop noticing it constantly. But that is always there. Roy Danforth had not had a DOJ credential. Roy Danforth had not had 14 years on a federal bench and a name that could clear a precinct in 30 minutes. Roy Danforth had had nothing except the truth and a 23-year-old public defender who did everything the law allowed and lost anyway. And Roy Danforth had gone to prison for 6 years, and Calvin had never been able to find him afterward, had looked twice in the years when looking was possible and had not found him. He stared at the misted window of the precinct. Someone has to be in the room. That was the thought. Not dramatic, not particularly new, but arriving with the specific weight that old thoughts acquire when they have been tested in real circumstances and found to still be true. Someone has to be in the room, and someone has to make the call. The Federal District Courthouse on Linden Avenue was a different kind of building from the Crestwood Heights precinct, where the precinct announced itself all that buffed granite and institutional fluorescence, all that visible investment in the semiotics of authority. The courthouse on Linden Avenue communicated through age and solidity, through the specific weight of oak paneling and marble floors worn smooth by decades of foot traffic, through the smell of old wood and old paper, and the kind of air conditioning that has been running continuously since 1971 and has never quite gotten the balance right between too cold and not cold enough. It was a room built for reckoning. Not drama reckoning, which is different, which is the steady methodical application of organized attention to the question of what actually happened and what should follow from it. 6 months had passed since Millbrook Road. In those 6 months, the federal investigation had moved with the kind of thorough, unhurried momentum that federal investigations develop when the evidence is clear and the institutional pressure to settle quietly has been neutralized by the scale of what's on record, which in this case was considerable. Brett Kowalski sat at the defense table. He was wearing a suit that was well made but that looked wrong on him now. Not because the suit had changed, but because the person inside it had, in the specific way that a person changes when the structure they have been leaning against is no longer there. When the thing that told them who they were is gone, and what's left is the person underneath, which is often less substantial than the structure made it appear. He was thinner, not dramatically. Not in the visible grief way of illness, just the natural thinning of a person who has been eating less because appetite requires a relationship with the future, and his relationship with the future had been for 6 months difficult to sustain. His attorney was a man named Gerald Croft, good enough experienced in federal cases, not a miracle worker, which was not what this case required, because miracle working implies that the facts are against you. And the facts in this case were not against you so much as they were a complete and detailed documentary record of everything that had happened, archived in a federal server that nobody had tampered with, documented in triplicate, available in full. The gallery was full, not in the way of celebrity trials or high-profile political cases. Not the performative fullness of people who want to be seen being present, but in the way of a community showing up because something happened that affected them, and they needed to witness the answer to it. In the gallery at the far end of a middle row sat a man in his mid-60s wearing a good coat and an expression that was patient and very still, and that Calvin, who was sitting 2 rows behind him, recognized without being able to place the expression of someone who has been waiting a long time for something, who is no longer certain what it will feel like when it arrives, but who has shown up anyway because showing up is what you do. Calvin did not know who he was. He was not the point. Judge George Whitmore took the bench at 9:17 a.m. Whitmore was 67 years old, a veteran of the federal bench whose reputation among attorneys was specific and consistent. He was fair, he was thorough, and he had no interest in being liked, which are 3 separate qualities that most judges aspire to, but that Whitmore had managed to hold simultaneously for more than 2 decades without losing any of them. He looked at the room. He looked at the defendant. He opened the case file. "We're on the record," he said. "Let's begin." The federal prosecutor was a woman named Patricia Haynes, 41 years old, short and precise, with the kind of delivery that stripped every sentence down to its exact necessary components and left nothing that could be argued with because there was nothing that could be removed. She did not make an opening argument so much as she constructed one, beginning with the dispatch record, moving to the dash cam footage, and arriving at the federal redundancy audio with the methodical confidence of someone laying a foundation rather than performing an appeal. The courtroom watched the dash cam footage on a large display screen at the front of the room. It played without narration. It played without music. It played without any of the editorial additions that the technology of modern storytelling has trained audiences to expect when they are being asked to understand something as significant. It just played in real time in the original high-definition clarity of the Axon Fleet 3 system, and what it showed was entirely unambiguously, without possibility of productive alternative interpretation, what it showed. A man in a charcoal suit sitting still in a well-lit car. A patrol officer approaching with an unclipped holster and a flashlight aimed at the mirror. A stop that produced no evidence of anything. A search that produced nothing. Hands wrenched behind a back, a head against a door frame, the rear door slamming. In the gallery, people were quiet in different ways, some quiet with the controlled stillness of people managing a strong emotion. Some quiet with the flat, exhausted quiet of people for whom what they were watching confirmed a thing they had known for a long time and had not needed the footage to believe but had waited anyway for the footage to exist. When the audio played, the prosecutor said nothing. She did not need to say anything. Kowalski's voice was clear. His words were clear. The recording quality was, if anything, uncomfortably intimate. You could hear the rain. You could hear the rhythm of Calvin's breathing. You could hear the specific timbre that Kowalski's voice had when he thought he was speaking in a space with no consequences. "Don't get smart with me, boy. I deal with garbage like you every day. You're looking at a felony charge, Art. That's prison time." The words moved through the courtroom the way a current moves through water. You couldn't see them, but you could feel the effect of their passage in the posture of the people they passed through. Kowalski's attorney made an objection. "Context," he said, framing, he said. And Haynes played the recording again from the beginning without responding, and the judge sustained her silence. The jury watched Kowalski. They had been watching him since the footage began, and what they were watching was not a man building a credible alternative narrative, but a man who had run out of narratives and was sitting in the place where the stories used to be. He walked to the stand in the same charcoal suit, not the same one that one was beyond recovery, had been bagged as evidence and would never be worn again. A new one from the same maker, the same precise color, which was an intentional choice because Calvin Holt had spent enough time in courtrooms to understand that what a person wears to testify is a form of statement. And the statement he was making was that the night on Millbrook Road had not changed who he was or what he presented to the world. He was sworn in. He looked out at the courtroom, at the attorneys, at the jury, at the gallery, with the particular attentiveness of a man who has spent 14 years on the side of the bench, where everyone looks to you rather than the side where you look to someone else, and who is now experiencing the reversal of that arrangement with a clarity that was educational in its own specific way. He did not look at Kowalski. Not yet. Patricia Haynes walked him through the events of November 14th with careful, methodical questioning, each question a door. She opened and then stepped back from allowing him to walk through at his own pace and in his own words. Because she had understood from their preparation sessions that Calvin Holt's testimony did not need ornamentation and did not benefit from guidance, that the most effective thing she could do was ask a clear question and get out of the way. He described the drive. He described the reroute. He described the appearance of the headlights in his mirror and the specific quality of attention that accompanied it, the calibrated watchfulness that was not panic and not paranoia, but the practiced self-awareness of a man who had been in enough versions of this situation to know what it required of him. He described the stop. He described the hands on the steering wheel. He described every narrated movement. He described the handcuffs. He described the door frame. He described the interior of the rear seat, the smell of disinfectant and old upholstery, the specific quality of the darkness, the windshield wipers. He described it all in the long, flowing, unhurried sentences of a man who is not dramatizing but is being precise, because precision is the language of record, and this was a record, and the record needed to carry everything that the people reading it would need in order to understand, not just what happened, but what it was like to be the person it happened to. Then Haynes asked the question she had been building toward. "Judge Holt, when those handcuffs were on your wrists and you were in the back of that patrol car, what were you thinking about?" Calvin paused. Not a dramatic pause. Not a performed one. Just the pause of a person who is taking the question seriously enough to answer it with care. "I was thinking about a man named Roy Danforth," he said, and he told them. He told them about Roy Danforth the way that you tell people about something you have been carrying for 30 years, not with the fresh grief of the recent loss, but with the settled, integrated weight of something that has become part of the structure of who you are. He told them about the case and the charge and the system's smooth, impersonal machinery that processed Roy Danforth the way it processed everything else, not with cruelty exactly, but without the friction of doubt, without the slightest pause to ask whether the shape of what it was looking at matched the shape of the thing it thought it was looking at. He told them he had lost. He told them he had stood in a hallway and decided something. And then he was quiet for a moment, and the courtroom was quiet with him, and what he said next was said in the voice of a man who is not reading from a prepared statement, but is arriving at a truth in real time, which is the most convincing kind of testimony because it cannot be rehearsed. What I was afraid of that night in that car with those cuffs on was not being in danger. I knew, because I know the law, and I know my own resources, that I was going to be all right. What frightened me, what still frightens me this morning in this room, is the absolute, complete certainty that if I had been a 22-year-old man without my credentials, if I had been a factory worker driving home from a night shift, or a college student on the wrong road, or anyone who looked the way I look on that road at that hour, I would be in a prison cell right now, and nobody in this building would know my name. He paused again. What Officer Kowalski did to me was not unusual. That is the most important thing I can tell this court. It was not unusual. It was routine. It was Tuesday. The only thing that was different about Tuesday night on Millbrook Road was that the person he chose happened to have spent 35 years acquiring the tools to hold him accountable for it. The question that this verdict needs to answer is not what happens to a man who does this to a federal judge. The question is what this tells us about what has been happening to everyone else. He looked at the jury. He looked at each face in turn, not with the pressure of a man trying to persuade them, but with the calm regard of a man who has said what is true and is now simply waiting for it to be received. Then he looked at Kowalski, for the first time since the stand. Kowalski looked at the table. Officer Danny Reeves was called after Calvin. He was 26 years old, and his voice was not steady, but the content of it was clear and consistent with every other piece of evidence before the court the pretextual stop admitted to openly in the break room. The fabricated charges the language used to describe Calvin Holt in the comfortable aftermath of an act that Kowalski believed had no witnesses and no recording and no future. Reeves had submitted a voluntary statement to the FBI 2 days after the night of the incident. He had done it before he was contacted. He had done it because the alternative sitting with what he knew, carrying it to his next shift and the shift after that, learning to set it aside. The way that certain people in certain institutions learn to set things aside until the setting aside becomes its own kind of identity, was a thing he had decided at 26 years old that he was not willing to become. He was not a hero for that. He was a person who made a choice that should not be notable, but was. And the notability of it was itself the thing that Calvin had talked about on the stand, and the jury understood the connection without being asked to draw it. The jury was out for 2 hours and 47 minutes. When they came back, the forewoman, a woman in her 50s with the bearing of someone who has been a manager of people for long enough that she does not fidget in her seat or avoid the eyes of the room. Read the verdict with the measured, neutral delivery of someone performing a function, not a performance. Guilty on the charge of deprivation of rights under color of law. Guilty on the charge of aggravated assault. Guilty on the charge of obstruction of justice. Guilty on the charge of falsification of official records. 4 counts. 4 times the same word arriving in the courtroom with the cumulative deepening weight of things that do not diminish with repetition but grow heavier. And the room received each one in the same concentrated silence, not the silence of shock, but the silence of people who needed the weight of it to land properly. Brett Kowalski sat very still. His attorney placed a hand briefly on his shoulder, the professional gesture of a man who has done what could be done and is now present for the part that comes after. And Kowalski's body did not react to the hand, did not stiffen or lean into it, because what was happening in a register beyond the physical reach of consolation. Judge Whitmore looked at the defendant. He did not look at him with anger. Judges who have been on the bench long enough have moved past anger as a default response to the things that come before them. Not because those things aren't worthy of anger, but because anger is imprecise, and imprecision is unprofessional. What he looked at Kowalski with was something closer to the considered regard of a man confronting a specific failure of a specific system, and intending to say something about it that will be on the record. "Mr. Kowalski," he said, and the room was entirely attentively silent. "You were given a badge and a uniform and the authority of the state of this country. That authority is not yours. It belongs to every person who lives in the territory you patrol, and it is administered by you on their behalf, in trust, with the explicit understanding that it will be used in service of their safety and not as a weapon against them." He looked at the sentencing documents on his desk. You violated that trust not once, not in a moment of lapse or error, but consistently, deliberately, and with the specific confidence of a person who had learned through the failure of every institutional check that should have stopped you that there were no consequences waiting. That confidence ends today. The sentence was 96 months in a federal penitentiary. Maximum security, followed by 10 years of supervised release. Permanent revocation of all law enforcement credentials, a lifetime ban from any position of public trust. The marshals moved. Click, click. The sound was the same sound, the same pitch, the same metallic authority of a mechanism engaging at the end of a sequence that cannot be undone. Kowalski walked. He walked the way people walk when walking is the only option, and every other option has been closed one foot, and then the other looking at the floor moving through the room that had held him accountable in the way that the rooms he had moved through for 9 years had never managed to. Calvin watched from the gallery. He watched until Kowalski was through the door. Then he looked down at his hands. His left wrist, the one with the old injury, the one that the handcuffs had found with their tightest setting, carried no visible mark now. 6 months was long enough for the skin to forget. The deeper tissue still remembered, still offered the occasional morning reminder of what had been pressed against it, but that was subsiding too. The man in the middle row, the one Calvin hadn't been able to place, had bowed his head. He was not crying. Or if he was, it was the private kind that a person can hold in their hands without anyone else seeing it. Calvin did not know his name. He did not know his story. He knew only what his posture communicated, which was that this verdict mattered to him in a way that went beyond the case, in a way that connected to something older and larger and more personal, and that was enough to know in the way that a great many things about other people's suffering are enough to know without needing the details. He came down the wide marble steps into a clear afternoon. The sky was the specific washed-out blue of late fall after a string of cloudy days, not warm, but bright with the kind of light that makes everything look more precise than it usually does. Edges, sharper, colors, cleaner. The world momentarily rendered in better resolution than its default setting. There were reporters near the base of the steps. He acknowledged them with a single nod, not a dismissal, but a signal the way you signal to people that you see them and are not stopping, and they understood it because a man who has spent 14 years on the federal bench has a particular relationship with the room's attention and knows how to hold it and release it without fanfare. He went down the steps. At the bottom, to the left of the railing, a young woman was standing with a tablet in her arms and a leather portfolio under her elbow, the specific posture of someone who has finished one task and is waiting to begin the next one. Precious Hall was 28 years old and had been Calvin's law clerk for 14 months, which was long enough for her to have developed an accurate model of what he needed from any given moment and a highly calibrated ability to provide it without being asked. She looked at him. "The Meridian case deposition is rescheduled for 9 a.m. tomorrow," she said. "And the Franklin motion is due Friday, but I've drafted the response. It's on your desk whenever you want it." He stopped on the bottom step, looked at her. "Are you all right?" she asked, and the question was genuine, not a formality, not a professional courtesy, but the actual inquiry of a person who is paying attention. He thought about it for a moment. "Yes," he said. "There's work. That's enough." He walked to the Lexus, the same Lexus repaired and detailed to a state of clean precision that it had not been in on Millbrook Road 6 months ago. He got in. He placed his hands on the steering wheel. 10 and 2. He sat there for a moment without starting the engine, just sitting in the afternoon quiet of a parking structure with his hands where they always were, in a car that was his on a day that had ended the way it should have, and let the particular quality of that be what it was. Not triumph, because triumph is what you feel when you've won something, and what today was not a win exactly, it was a correction. And corrections are quieter than wins. Less satisfying in the immediate sense, but more durable, more structural, more important in the ways that matter past the moment. He started the engine. He pulled out into the traffic. Nobody followed. The badge was gone before the trial began. It had been collected on the night of his arrest, retrieved from his duty belt by Agent Osei's partner, with the same procedural efficiency with which everything else had been collected that night, bagged, tagged, and entered into evidence, and it would not be returned, because the law that governed what happened to a law enforcement officer convicted of felony abuse of authority had a specific and unambiguous answer to the question of whether they got their badge back, which was that they did not. That was the first tier. The immediate tier. The tier that happened in the days and weeks after the night on Millbrook Road, before the trial, before the verdict, before any of the subsequent layers of consequence had been applied. His pension had been a separate matter handled through a parallel process that moved with the particular deliberateness of civil proceedings that involve money and therefore involve more careful attention to documentation, and which reached its conclusion 4 months after his arrest, with a finding that his conviction for deprivation of rights under color of law triggered the federal civil forfeiture provisions applicable to public officials whose criminal conduct arose from their exercise of official authority, which was a long and carefully assembled sentence that meant in practical terms that the 23 years of contributions he had made to the retirement system would not be waiting for him when he came out of prison. He had not yet processed this fully when the second tier arrived. His wife Karen had attended the trial every day. She had sat in the gallery in the same seat toward the back near the aisle where she could leave quickly if she needed to, and she had listened to the testimony and watched the footage and heard the audio recording, and she had left on the day the audio was played and had not come back. The divorce papers were filed 6 weeks after the verdict. Not because of the verdict, she said this in the single conversation they had about it conducted through the glass of a visiting room and lasting 11 minutes, but because of the recording. Because the recording was not the story of a mistake or a moment of bad judgment or a lapse under pressure, it was the story of a comfortable voice in a comfortable space saying things that a person only says when they believe themselves to be entirely unobserved. And what it revealed was not what Brett Kowalski had done, but who Brett Kowalski was when nobody was watching, and who Brett Kowalski was when nobody was watching was not a person she recognized, and was not a person she was willing to continue organizing her life around. Their son Tyler was 9 years old. He was enrolled in a new school in a town 3 hours away under his mother's maiden name, which was not a legal name change but a social one, a practical decision made by a woman trying to manage the distance between her child's daily life and the weight of a public record that was going to follow the family name for a long time. Tyler was 9. He would understand things eventually that he did not understand now in the specific way that children grow into comprehension of their parents' histories and find themselves holding information that reconfigures things they thought they knew. That was the second tier. The third tier was the slowest and the longest and in certain ways the most permanent. The name Brett Kowalski entered the training curriculum of the Regional Police Academy 8 months after the verdict. Not as a villain in a cautionary tale of the dramatic variety, not as a monster from whom the lesson to be drawn is that monsters exist, but as a case study in the specific, boring, well-documented mechanics of how an institution fails when it replaces accountability with the path of least resistance, when it learns to describe the complaints of vulnerable people as unfounded, because processing them as founded requires a kind of institutional courage that is easier to defer than to exercise. The trainers who used the case were instructed not to make it about the exceptional, not about the FBI, not about the federal judge, not about the particular set of circumstances that resulted in the full weight of evidence being available and irrefutable, but about the ordinary, which was the 3 complaints that had been ruled unfounded, the 3 people whose names were not Calvin Holt, and whose outcomes had not been today's outcome, and the question of what the institution owed to the Roy Danforths of the world who did not have credentials in their pockets. The lesson was not, don't do what Kowalski did because you might get caught. The lesson was, the badge is a contract, and a contract has 2 parties, and you do not get to decide unilaterally when it applies and when it doesn't. It was not a lesson that all students absorbed equally, but it was in the curriculum now. And it had Brett Kowalski's name on it, which was not the legacy he had imagined for himself when he had been 27 years old and new to the job and full of the specific confidence of a person who has just been given authority and has not yet been asked to account for how they use it. Raymond Pruitt did not go to prison. This was a fact that some people found unsatisfying and that Calvin, when asked about it in the only interview he gave on the subject, described as within the range of outcomes that the law produced given the evidence available, which was not an expression of satisfaction, but was not an expression of dissatisfaction. Either it was the specific, careful language of a man who had spent his professional life distinguishing between what he thought should happen and what the law actually required. What happened to Pruitt was this. The DOJ investigation into Crestwood Heights, PD, opened 6 days after Kowalski's arrest and remained open for 14 months, during which time it reviewed not just the Kowalski incident, but the full disciplinary record of the department going back 8 years. And what it found was what investigations of this kind typically find when they look carefully enough, which was not a conspiracy. Conspiracies require coordination and communication and a shared awareness of the wrongdoing, none of which was present here but something more diffuse and more common and in some ways more difficult to address, which was an institutional culture of selective inattention. A habitual tendency to believe certain reports and disbelieve others, to find certain complaints credible and others not, based on criteria that were never written down and were never examined, but that produced consistent patterns across years and cases that were visible the moment someone decided to look. Pruitt had not created that culture. He had inherited it, and he had maintained it, and he had made the choice many times in many small ways to keep it running, because running it was easier than changing it, and because changing it would have required him to discomfort people who had the power to affect his career. And his career had always, when it came to it, ranked slightly above his principles in the order of things he protected. He resigned under pressure in the 4th month of the investigation. His pension was reduced by 30% under a breach of duty provision that applied to department heads found to have knowingly failed to act on documented misconduct under their authority. He moved to a smaller house. He retired. He was not a figure in the ongoing story that the case produced in public discourse, and this was because his role was structural rather than dramatic. He was the person through whom the institution's failure was channeled rather than the person who committed it, which made him harder to focus on and easier to set aside. But the reduction in pension was there in the documents, and the question that Frank Dolan had answered honestly in the middle of the night the other times I told myself it wasn't my call. Nobody else was looking could equally have been asked of Raymond Pruitt, and he knew it, and he was going to know it for the rest of his life in the specific, quiet way that things you cannot undo continue to present themselves to you in the ordinary spaces of daily living. In the car, in the morning. In the house, in the evening. In the small accumulating hours between sleep and waking, where there is nothing to do but be with what you have done and what you have not done and what the difference between them cost. Frank Dolan retired on schedule. He attended his own retirement party in the second-floor conference room of the precinct, not the same precinct which was under new management and new oversight and a new name for its internal accountability process, and he ate the cake that his wife had baked, and he accepted the handshakes of people he had worked with for 3 decades, and he drove home that evening and sat at the kitchen table for a while drinking decaf because the regular coffee had started interfering with his sleep. And he thought about the night with the kind of backward-glancing attention that retirement tends to produce. He did not think of himself as a hero. He was specifically not interested in thinking of himself as a hero because heroes are defined by exceptional circumstances, and the thing he had done was not exceptional. It was simply what should have happened all 3 times before it finally happened. What he thought about was the gap. The gap between what he knew and what he had done with what he knew, and the gap that had been 3 complaints wide before it closed before the combination of a specific set of eyes and a specific quality of exhaustion and a pen that paused before writing had finally been enough to narrow it to nothing. He had been cited in the federal investigation report as the officer who initiated the alert that led to the identification of the detainee and the notification of federal authorities. Bureaucratic language that contained somewhere inside it the fact that he had put down a pen and picked up a phone, which was not a complicated action, which had not required courage in the dramatic sense, but had required the specific courage of doing the right thing at the right moment, regardless of what had been done the previous 3 times when the right thing had been available and had not been done. He thought about Calvin's question. Why this time? Because tonight I looked at you before I knew who you were. He still believed that was true. He still believed that it was also not enough as an explanation for why the previous 3 times had produced a different answer. Because Harold Briggs and Diane Mosley and Terrence Waits had also been people he had looked at before he knew who they were, and he had not made a call those nights, and the difference between those nights and this one was something he was still not fully able to account for, and he suspected he never would be, and he suspected that living with that incomplete accounting was part of what the next stage of his life was going to involve. His granddaughter came to visit on Saturdays. She was 6 years old, and she liked to sit in his lap while he read to her from a series of illustrated books about animals that lived in places she had never been. And in those moments, the specific warmth of a 6-year-old's weight, and the smell of the books and the afternoon light through the kitchen window, the accounting didn't seem to be what the moment required. The moment required him to be present. So he was. He went back to work the following Monday. The Meridian deposition at 9, the Franklin motion response at 2. A scheduling conference at 4 that ran until 5:30, because scheduling conferences always run until 5:30, which is a law as reliable as gravity. Precious Hall had left the newspaper article on his desk not prominently. Not in the center, just folded to the relevant page and placed at the corner of the blotter where he would see it without it being impossible to ignore. He looked at it. He noted the headline. He moved it to the recycling tray and opened the Meridian file. He was not indifferent to what the article said. He was not and had never been the kind of man who managed emotion through suppression rather than through integration. He was simply a person who had a job in front of him and a clear understanding of what the job required, and the job required his full attention, which was what he gave it. He still took off his glasses at 4 in the afternoon and rubbed his eyes. He still said goodnight to Robert Deans on the way out, called him by name, and asked how the daughter who had gotten into nursing school was doing. She was doing well, Robert said, was already talking about specialization, and Calvin said that was excellent and meant it. He still drove with his hands at 10 and 2. A month after the trial, he was presiding over a minor case, a 26-year-old man named Devin Cartwright, charged with disorderly conduct following an altercation that the police report described in the flat, slightly compressed language of official documentation that Calvin had been reading for 35 years, and that he had learned to read not just for what it said, but for what it chose not to say. Devin Cartwright did not know who Calvin Holt was. He sat at the defense table in a shirt that was not quite right for the occasion. Not dirty, not disrespectful. Just the shirt of someone who didn't own enough dress shirts to have learned which ones were appropriate for which rooms, and he looked at the bench with the expression of a person who has found themselves in a system they don't fully understand and is trying without quite enough information to figure out what it wants from them. Calvin read the file. He asked questions. He asked the prosecutor questions that the prosecutor had apparently not anticipated, specific, precise questions about the timeline, about the witness accounts, about the initial stop, about the specific interaction that had preceded the moment, described as disorderly in the report. The answers, as they emerged, did not support the charge. Not in the way that the charge would need to be supported to warrant the outcome it was pursuing. Calvin ruled accordingly. Devin Cartwright walked out of the courtroom a free man. He did not know what had happened specifically. He knew that the man on the bench had asked questions that nobody had asked before, and that the answers had produced a different result than he had been expecting. He didn't know the name. He would not have recognized it if he had heard it. He just went home. That was enough. Calvin's left wrist still offered its occasional morning reminder, the joint achier in cold weather than in warm, the ghost of pressure that had been applied there in the rain on Millbrook Road, still visiting sometimes in the shallow hours before dawn, still delivering its specific, unremarkable message. He did not try to silence it. It was useful. Some things are meant to be remembered, not because remembering them changes anything about what happened, but because the forgetting of them costs something that the remembering does not. And because the bench he sat on every morning was held accountable by the weight of what he had not forgotten. And because somewhere in the country, somewhere in a town he had never been to, living a life, he had no information about a man named Roy. Danforth had once been 24 years old and had needed someone in the room and had not had that. And Calvin Holt was in the room now and had been for 14 years and intended to go on being there for as long as the law and his strength and his capacity to pay attention allowed. 14 months after the night on Millbrook Road, the state legislature passed a bill. It was not a high-profile bill. It did not arrive with the momentum of a crisis, was not driven by a single galvanizing event broadcast to millions, did not have a celebrity advocate or a cultural moment to carry it forward. It was a careful, methodical piece of legislation that had been drafted by a working group of attorneys, law enforcement professionals, civil rights advocates, and 2 retired judges, and that had been revised through 11 drafts over the course of a year, and that addressed 3 specific things. The mandatory implementation of federal-grade redundant recording in all patrol vehicles statewide. The requirement that any complaint ruled unfounded by an internal review be automatically referred to an external oversight board for independent evaluation, and the establishment of a public disclosure requirement whenever an officer with prior complaints received a promotion or an expanded assignment. It was called the Accountability and Enforcement Standards Act. In the official legislative record, it was referred to informally as the Danforth-Holt Standards. Danforth first, at Calvin's specific and emphatic request during the one consultation he had with the bill's primary sponsor, because Roy Danforth had been the one who had needed protection and had not received it, and Calvin Holt had been the one who had had protection he hadn't needed to call on, and the law that came out of the difference between those 2 circumstances should acknowledge which of them the legislature was actually trying to serve. Roy Danforth did not know his name was on a law. Calvin had tried one more time to find him, had asked a mutual acquaintance from the old public defender days, had followed the lead as far as it went, and had come up against the specific privacy of a person who had at some point chosen not to be found by the people connected to the part of their life they most wanted to put behind them. Calvin understood that. He did not pursue it further. The law was there, carrying the name. That was what could be done, and it was what had been done, and the doing of it was enough in the way that things are enough when they are the limit of the possible, not perfect, not complete, not the full answer to everything that the question implied, but real and present and available to the next person who needed it. In one of his last appearances as a public speaker before a judicial conference the following spring, Calvin was asked what he thought the most important lesson of the Millbrook Road incident was. He said that it was the lesson he had learned from Frank Dolan. Not the lesson about evidence, though evidence mattered. Not the lesson about accountability, though accountability was the whole point. Not even the lesson about the law's capacity to correct itself, though that capacity was the reason he had dedicated his life to it. The lesson from Frank Dolan was smaller than any of those things, and more specific and harder to teach in a curriculum and harder to legislate into existence. Look at the person before you decide what you're looking at. That was it. That was the whole lesson. You do not need a federal judge in the back of the patrol car for the lesson to apply. You do not need a DOJ credential, or 14 years on the bench, or a tamper-proof recording system to make the basic act of accurate human perception available to a person who is standing in front of someone else and deciding who they are and what they deserve. You just have to look, before you decide, and then tell the truth about what you saw. Calvin buttoned his jacket. He straightened his glasses. He walked back to the bench. If you've ever waited for the truth to finally come out, if you've ever called for someone who abused their power to face real consequences, then you know exactly why this story matters. Because Calvin Holt was one man on one rainy night in a town he was just passing through. But his story is the story of every person who has ever had to decide between compliance and dignity, between surviving the moment and building the record that outlasts it. And Brett Kowalski is not the story of one bad cop. He is the story of what happens when institutions choose comfort over accountability over and over and over until someone finally says no more, says no. If this story reached you, if it made you think or feel or remember someone you know, hit that like button and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe to our channel so you never miss another story like this one. And to everyone out there carrying the weight of waiting for justice to finally show up, keep waiting. Keep calling. The record has a way of correcting itself eventually. Stay safe, stay strong, and remember the law is a shield, not a sword. This story is a fictional dramatization created for entertainment and educational purposes. Any resemblance to real persons living or dead or actual events is purely coincidental.